provide, that sacrifice is necessary for satisfaction to occur.
You're an outright utilitarian.
Yes. Okay.
All right, then one last question, Raul.
Okay.
And I put this to Wojtek. What dollar figure should be put on human life to decide whether to ban the use of cell phones?
Well, I don't want to arbitrarily calculate a figure. I mean, right now, I think that...
You want to take it under advisement?
Yeah, I'll take it under advisement.
But what, roughly speaking, would it be? You've got 2,300 deaths.
Okay.
You've got to assign a dollar value to know whether you want to prevent those deaths by banning the use of cell phones in cars.
Okay.
So, what would your hunch be? How much? 1 million? 2 million? 2 million was Wojtek's figure.
Yeah.
Is that about right?
Maybe 1 million.
1 million?
Yeah.
You know, that's good. Thank you.
Okay.
So these are some of the controversies that arise these days from cost-benefit analysis, especially those that involve placing a dollar value on everything to be added up. Well, now I want to turn to your objections. To your objections not necessarily to cost-benefit analysis specifically, because that's just one version of the utilitarian logic in practice today, but to the theory as a whole, to the idea that the right thing to do, the just basis for policy and law, is to maximize utility. How many disagree with the utilitarian approach to law and to the common good? How many agree with it? So more agree than disagree. So let's hear from the critics. Yes?
My main issue with it is that I feel like you can't say that just because someone's in the minority, what they want and need is less valuable than someone who's in the majority. So I guess I have an issue with the idea that the greatest good for the greatest number is okay, because there's still, what about the people who are in the lesser number? Like, it's not fair to them. They didn't have any say in where they wanted to be.
All right, that's an interesting objection. You're worried about the effect on the minority.
Yes.
What's your name, by the way?
Anna.
Who has an answer to Anna's worry about the effect on the minority? What do you say to Anna?
She said that the minorities value less. I don't think that's the case, because individually the minority's value is just the same as the individual of the majority. It's just that the numbers outweigh the minority. And I mean, at a certain point you have to make a decision, and I'm sorry for the minority, but sometimes it's for the general, for the greater good.
For the greater good. Anna, what do you say? What's your name?
Yangda.
What do you say to Yangda? Yangda says you just have to add up people's preferences, and those in the minority do have their preferences weighed. Can you give an example of the kind of thing you're worried about when you say you're worried about utilitarianism violating the concern or respect due the minority?
Okay.
Can you give an example?
So, well, with any of the cases that we've talked about, like for the shipwreck one, I think the boy who was eaten still had as much of a right to live as the other people, and just because he was the minority in that case, the one who maybe had less of a chance to keep living, that doesn't mean that the others automatically have a right to eat him just because it would give a greater amount of people the chance to live.
So there may be certain rights that the minority members have, that the individual has, that shouldn't be traded off for the sake of utility?
Yes.
Yes, Anna? Yeah, this would be a test for you. Back in ancient Rome, they threw Christians to the lions in the Colosseum for sport. If you think how the utilitarian calculus would go, yes, the Christian thrown to the lion suffers enormous, excruciating pain. But look at the collective ecstasy of the Romans. Yanda.
Well, in that time, I don't, in modern day of time, to value to give a number to the happiness given to the people watching, I don't think any policymaker would say the pain of the suffering of one person is much, in comparison to the happiness gained.
No, but you have to admit that if there were enough Romans delirious enough with happiness, it would outweigh even the most excruciating pain of a handful of Christians thrown to the lion. So we really have here two different objections to utilitarianism. One has to do with whether utilitarianism adequately respects individual rights or minority rights, and the other has to do with the whole idea of aggregating utility or preferences or values. Is it possible to aggregate all values to translate them into dollar terms? There was, in the 1930s, a psychologist who tried to address this second question. He tried to prove what utilitarianism assumes, that it is possible to translate all goods, all values, all human concerns into a single uniform measure. And he did this by conducting a survey of young recipients of relief. This was in the 1930s. And he gave them a list of unpleasant experiences. And he asked them, how much would you have to be paid to undergo the following experiences? And he kept track. For example, how much would you have to be paid to have one upper front tooth pulled out? Or how much would you have to be paid to have one little toe cut off? Or to eat a live earthworm 6 inches long? Or to live the rest of your life on a farm in Kansas? Or to choke a stray cat to death with your bare hands? Now, what do you suppose was the most expensive item on that list? Kansas? You're right, it was Kansas. For Kansas, people said they'd have to be paid $300,000. What do you think was the next most expensive? Not the cat. Not the tooth. Not the toe. The worm. People said you'd have to pay them $100,000 to eat the worm. What do you think was the least expensive item? Not the cat. The tooth. During the Depression, people were willing to have their tooth pulled for only $4,500. Now, here's what Thorndike concluded from his study. Any want or satisfaction which exists in some amount and is therefore measurable. The life of a dog or a cat or a chicken consists of appetites, cravings, desires, and their gratifications. So does the life of human beings, though the appetites and desires are more complicated. But what about Thorndike's study? Does it support Bentham's idea that all goods, all values can be captured according to a single uniform measure of value? Or does the preposterous character of those different items on the list suggest the opposite conclusion, that maybe, whether we're talking about life or Kansas or the worm, maybe the things we value and cherish can't be captured according to a single uniform measure of value? And if they can't, what are the consequences for the utilitarian theory of morality? That's a question we'll continue with next time. All right, now let's take the other part of the poll. Which is the highest experience or pleasure? How many say Shakespeare? How many say Fear Factor? No, you can't be serious. Really? Last time we began to consider some objections to Jeremy Bentham's version of utilitarianism. People raised two objections in the discussion we had. The first was the objection, the claim, that utilitarianism, by concerning itself with the greatest good for the greatest number, fails adequately to respect individual rights. Today we have debates about torture and terrorism. Suppose a suspected terrorist was apprehended on September 10th, and you had reason to believe that the suspect had crucial information about an impending terrorist attack that would kill over 3,000 people, and you couldn't extract the information. Would it be just to torture the suspect to get the information? Or do you say, no, there is a categorical moral duty of respect for individual rights? In a way, we're back to the questions we started with about trolley cars and organ transplants. So that's the first issue. And you remember we considered some examples of cost-benefit analysis. But a lot of people were unhappy with cost-benefit analysis when it came to placing a dollar value on human life. And so that led us to the second objection. It questioned whether it's possible to translate all values into a single uniform measure of value. It asks, in other words, whether all values are commensurable. Let me give you one other example of an experience. This actually is a true story. It comes from personal experience that raises a question, at least, about whether all values can be translated without loss into utilitarian terms. Some years ago, when I was a graduate student, I was at Oxford in England, and they had men's and women's colleges. They weren't yet mixed. And the women's colleges had rules against overnight male guests.